November the 30th, 1943. Thran, Iran, the Soviet embassy's subterranean levels. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich. Zhukov's hand paused mid-signature on the operational directive, his pen hovering above words destined never to appear in any official Soviet record. Without the 400,000 trucks we are acquiring from the Americans, this offensive would be utterly impossible. We are moving our entire armies on American wheels. Through the embassy's window, he could faintly discern the rumble of American-manufactured Studebaker engines navigating Tehran's avenues, transporting Soviet provisions for the upcoming conference where Stalin would convene with Roosevelt and Churchill. In that precise moment, the Soviet Union's most heralded military commander faced a stark reality that would remain concealed within classified repositories for close to 50 years. The Red Army, relentlessly pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin, was propelled by American trucks, fueled by American gasoline, and sustained by American provisions. Absent this indispensable aid, as Stalin himself would later acknowledge in a private libation just hours onward, the Soviet Union would have undoubtedly succumbed to defeat in the conflict. A total of 427,284 American trucks and jeeps would traverse the perilous Arctic convoys, the Persian Corridor, and the Pacific route, ultimately reaching Soviet hands. This constituted a greater number of vehicles than the Soviet Union itself manufactured throughout the entirety of the war. Indeed, it surpassed the total number of trucks possessed by most nations combined. These mechanical marvels would fundamentally transform the Red Army from a force operating at the pace of marching soldiers and cavalry into a mechanized juggernaut capable of sustaining operations across battlefronts stretching thousands of miles. What none of the Soviet officers present that day in Thran could have possibly foreseen was that their candid admissions concerning American assistance were being meticulously documented, not only by American stenographers, but also by their own NKVD agents, thereby crafting a clandestine record that would starkly contradict decades of Soviet propaganda concerning the Great Patriotic War. The truth regarding Soviet logistical capabilities commenced with a devastating setback. On June 22, 1941, a staggering 3,800,000 Axis soldiers launched an overwhelming assault across the Soviet border in what was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. They encountered a Red Army woefully ill-equipped to contend with the demands of mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet, numbering approximately 700,000 vehicles, comprised predominantly the Ghazi AA, a licensed replica of the 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZS-5, based on American designs from the 1920s. Within a mere 6 months, 40% of this fleet lay either destroyed or captured. The figures painted a bleak picture of industrial inadequacy, a reality that Soviet propaganda would endeavor to obscure for decades. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced a mere 124,176 trucks, while simultaneously losing nearly 300,000. The GAZ factory in Gorky, the nation's primary truck manufacturer, was compelled to be evacuated eastward as German forces advanced, reducing its output to a mere trickle. The ZIS factory in Moscow was repurposed for tank production as the Wehrmacht's vanguard stood at the city's very gates. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies were forced to advance on foot, with their artillery being hauled by horses whenever such beasts could even be found. The Second Shock Army, trapped within the Volkhov Pocket, lost 95% of its transportation assets in its desperate attempt to break out. Soldiers were forced to carry shells on their backs for artillery pieces they could no longer move. This was the Red Army that American aid would ultimately revolutionize, though it would take Soviet leaders a full 40 years to publicly acknowledge this profound transformation. The Wehrmacht's swift mechanized thrusts had unequivocally demonstrated the fundamental requirements of modern warfare: mobility, speed, and dependable logistics. Soviet forces, despite their considerable numerical superiority in many respects, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered and encircled due to their inability to match the Germans' rapid movement. Infantry divisions that should have been motorized were forced to march on foot. Artillery batteries requiring prime movers were reliant on horses that perished by the thousands during the brutal Russian winter. October 1st, 1941. Arkhangelsk Port, Soviet Arctic. The British convoy PQ-1 discharged its vital cargo in the frigid gloom of the Arctic autumn. 20 American trucks, the very vanguard of what would soon become an overwhelming torrent, rolled onto Soviet territory. These Chevrolets, with their enclosed cabins and dependable engines, appeared as miracles to Soviet drivers accustomed to vehicles that demanded hours of meticulous maintenance for every single hour of operation. By November 1941, at a time when the Wehrmacht stood a mere 12 miles from the Kremlin, American trucks were already arriving at a formidable rate of 2,000 per month via multiple ingress routes. The Persian Corridor, meticulously managed by American engineers who had taken control of the Iranian State Railway, witnessed a staggering 60% expansion in its capacity. The Pacific route, although restricted to non-military supplies due to the ongoing Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, still facilitated the movement of thousands of vehicles. The perilous Arctic convoys, despite incurring substantial losses to U-boat and Luftwaffe assaults, steadfastly continued to deliver their invaluable cargo. The vehicles themselves represented a significant technological leap that Soviet mechanics could scarcely comprehend. The Studebaker US-6 boasted a 6-wheel drive system with all 6 wheels actively powered, a stark contrast to the 4-wheeled Soviet trucks with only 2 powered wheels. Its engine delivered 94 horsepower compared to the ZS-5's 73. Most critically, the American trucks were equipped with self-recovery winches, enabling them to extricate themselves from mud that would otherwise ensnare Soviet vehicles until the spring thaw. These trucks arrived fully outfitted with an array of tools that Soviet forces had never encountered before. Comprehensive 128-piece toolkits, hydraulic jacks, tire repair apparatus, and spare parts catalogs with meticulously numbered components. A typical Soviet truck, if it came with any tools at all, was supplied with basic hand tools. The Americans had anticipated every conceivable need. Cold weather starting equipment, cabin heaters that actually functioned effectively, and sealed electrical systems designed to withstand wet conditions without shorting out. The Tehran Conference, held from November the 28th to December the 1st, 1943, yielded one of the most extraordinary admissions in Soviet history, although it would remain classified in American archives until 1961 and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. During a private dinner on November the 30th, attended only by Roosevelt, Churchill, and their most trusted advisors, Stalin rose to propose a toast that directly contradicted every assertion Soviet propaganda would propagate for the ensuing half-century. According to Charles Bolin, Roosevelt's interpreter, Stalin declared, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we receive through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Stalin had specifically emphasized trucks during the subsequent technical discussions. The Soviet leader stated that the American Studebakers were the finest trucks in the world for our conditions and referred to them as the very foundation of Soviet mobility. Yet, a mere 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin would publicly proclaim that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary, constituting only about 10% of Soviet production. This fabrication would solidify into Soviet dogma, rigorously enforced by censors and historians who were privy to the truth but prioritized their careers and lives above historical accuracy. The records from the Tehran Conference also revealed other crucial acknowledgments. Marshal Clement Voroshilov informed American logistics officers, Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us. This sentiment emanated from a military leader who publicly attributed the victory solely to Soviet industry. To fully comprehend why American trucks proved so decisive, one must grasp the fundamental arithmetic of Soviet logistics. A single Soviet rifle division engaged in an offensive operation required a staggering 450 tons of supplies daily, encompassing ammunition, food, fuel, and medical provisions. In a defensive posture, it necessitated 300 tons. A tank corps demanded 1,000 tons. Transporting these essential supplies from railheads to the front lines across the Soviet Union's rudimentary road network was entirely dependent on trucks. Major General Andrei Krylyov, chief of Soviet military logistics, compiled statistics in 1943 that remained classified until 1991. His report laid bare the stark mathematical realities. The Red Army required a minimum of 450,000 trucks for offensive operations. Soviet production from January to September 1943 totaled a mere 49,000 vehicles. In contrast, American deliveries during the same period reached 94,000 vehicles. Without these American vehicles, Soviet forces would have been incapable of operating beyond 50 kilometers from railway lines. The qualitative disparity was as significant as the quantitative. Soviet trucks, primarily the ZES-5 and Gezi models, possessed cargo capacities ranging from 2.5 to 3 tons, but rarely carried more than 1.5 tons on rough front-line roads without experiencing mechanical failure. American Studebaker US-6s, rated for 2.5 tons, routinely transported 5 tons on well-maintained roads and 3 tons cross-country. Their mean time between failures was 10,000 kilometers, a remarkable improvement compared to the 2,000 kilometers for Soviet trucks. The mechanical superiority extended beyond mere reliability. American trucks incorporated innovations that Soviet designers had not even conceived of, including air brakes that functioned reliably in all weather conditions, aluminum pistons that reduced engine weight, oil filters that effectively filtered contaminants, and thermostats that maintained optimal engine temperature. Soviet trucks were equipped with mechanical brakes that faltered when wet, cast-iron pistons, settling tanks that seldom performed as intended, and engines that operated either too cold in winter or overheated in summer. While the Arctic convoys captured public imagination with their desperate battles against the U-boats, the Persian Corridor quietly emerged as the primary conduit for American trucks reaching Soviet forces. This 4,000-mile supply line, stretching from American ports through Iran to the Soviet frontier, represented one of the most monumental logistical achievements in military history. American engineers transformed Iran's primitive infrastructure within a matter of months. They inherited a single-track railway capable of transporting a mere 200 tons daily and dramatically increased its capacity to 6,000 tons. They constructed highways where only camel tracks had previously existed. They erected assembly plants in the desert, capable of processing 300 trucks per day. The truck assembly plant at Dimeshq became a potent symbol of American industrial might. Relocated to the Middle East, Soviet drivers, after arduous journeys from the Caucasus, would receive 3 days of intensive training on American vehicles before driving their newly acquired trucks 1,800 miles back to the front lines. The cultural dissonance was profound. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to vehicles that necessitated constant, often rudimentary, repairs, suddenly found themselves commanding machines that simply worked. By mid-1943, the Persian Corridor was facilitating the delivery of thousands of trucks each month. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled a mere 50,000 tons annually before the war, was now processing an astonishing 250,000 tons per month. American efficiency astounded Soviet liaison officers who reported back to Moscow about dock operations that unloaded ships in an unprecedented 48 hours, tasks that typically required 2 weeks at Soviet ports. The total number of vehicles delivered via this vital route reached into the tens of thousands, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of all American trucks destined for the Soviet Union arrived through Iran. The corridor operated with an efficiency that Soviet logistics officers studied intently and attempted to replicate, though they lacked the requisite industrial infrastructure to match American methodologies. The strategic coupling of American trucks with Soviet rocket artillery forged one of the most formidable weapon systems of the Second World War. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had originally been mounted on ZIS-6 trucks, but production of this particular vehicle ceased in late 1941. The few rail-mounted and towed versions proved nearly ineffective in mobile warfare. The Studebaker US-6 fundamentally altered this landscape. Its reinforced chassis was capable of withstanding the violent recoil of a full rocket salvo. Its six-wheel drive system enabled it to fire and rapidly relocate before German counter-battery fire could arrive. The cross-country performance of the Studebaker was so superior that it became the standardized mounting in 1943, designated the BM-13N. More than 1,000, almost 800 of these standardized Studebaker-mounted systems were manufactured by the war's conclusion. Guard formations equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas achieved survival rates that were 400% higher than those utilizing Soviet vehicles. The crucial ability to shoot and scoot, to fire a salvo and relocate within 3 minutes, was entirely dependent on dependable vehicles. Soviet trucks, when they functioned at all, required 15 minutes for the same maneuver. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers nicknamed them Stalin's organs, but astutely noted that they rode on American trucks. The standardization on American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics. A single manual, a unified set of parts, and a consistent training regimen replaced the ad hoc improvisation that had characterized earlier efforts. Production mathematics. An analysis of production statistics reveals the stark mathematical impossibility of a Soviet victory without American trucks. Soviet vehicle production during the war totaled approximately 1941, 46,100 vehicles from June 22nd. 1942, 32,300 vehicles. 1943, 41,600 vehicles. 1944, 57,400 vehicles. 1945, 27,600 vehicles through May. Total wartime Soviet truck production reached approximately 205,000 units, less than half the American contribution of 427,284 vehicles. Against this, losses were catastrophic, with nearly 300,000 vehicles lost in 1941 alone, and continued losses throughout the war totaling over 500,000 vehicles. Absent American deliveries, the Soviet vehicle park would have dwindled to nothing by mid-1942. Every Soviet offensive launched after Stalingrad was fundamentally reliant on American wheels. By 1945, American-built vehicles constituted 33% of the Red Army's total vehicle fleet, but accounted for 70% of its actual transport capacity due to their superior carrying capacity and inherent reliability. The economic dimension was equally critical. A single Studebaker US-6 cost $1,830 to produce in 1943. The Soviet Union received them free through Lend-Lease. To produce equivalent vehicles domestically would have cost the Soviet Union approximately $800 million in 1943, representing resources desperately needed for tank and aircraft production, not to mention the industrial capacity the USSR simply did not possess. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23, 1944, definitively demonstrated that American trucks had transformed Soviet operational capability. This massive offensive, which resulted in the destruction of German Army Group Center and inflicted 450,000 casualties, would have been utterly inconceivable without American vehicles. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's operational planning vividly illustrated the mathematical dependency. His first Belarusian front required 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Soviet railways could deliver to depots situated 60 to 100 kilometers behind the front lines. From that point onward, only trucks could sustain the advance. Rokossovsky possessed 19,000 trucks, 14,000 of which were American. The speed of the advance, a remarkable 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, completely overwhelmed German planning, which had predicated Soviet operational capability on assumed pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to rebuild logistics. Wehrmacht. Intelligence had calculated Soviet offensive potential based on indigenous Soviet truck production, unaware that American vehicles had tripled the Red Army's transport capacity. During Bagration's 5-week duration, American trucks in Soviet service transported 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded personnel. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, itself largely delivered by other American trucks. Soviet truck production for the entire year of 1944 could not have sustained the offensive for even a single week. The contrast with earlier operations was stark. The failed Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 had stalled partly because Soviet forces outran their logistics within a mere few days. By 1944, thanks to American trucks, Soviet forces could maintain offensive momentum for weeks, transforming tactical victories into strategic triumphs. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, left behind 3 separate testimonies concerning American aid that remained concealed until the Soviet Union's collapse. Each testimony provided details that fundamentally dismantled the myth of Soviet self-sufficiency. The first testimony emerged from KGB surveillance transcripts. In 1963, during a private conversation at his dacha, unaware of hidden microphones, Zhukov stated, "People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." The second testimony came in interviews conducted with the writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966. Tape recordings of these interviews remained suppressed until 1990. Zhukov was unequivocal. "Without American Studs, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. To a considerable degree, they provided our front transport." The third account appeared in Zhukov's unpublished manuscript, which was seized in 1969 and kept under lock and key in archives until 1992. Analyzing the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov wrote about the critical importance of American trucks in delivering 2.2 million artillery shells within a 2-week period, a feat made possible only by American vehicles making continuous supply runs. Nikita Khrushchev's secretly recorded memoirs, smuggled to the West in 1970, contain perhaps the most comprehensive admission regarding Soviet dependence on American aid. His testimony was authenticated through voice analysis and corroborated by other sources following the Soviet Union's dissolution. I would like to express my candid opinion about Stalin's views on whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could have coped with Nazi Germany and survived the war without aid from the United States and Britain, Khrushchev stated. He declared bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure and we would have lost the war. Khrushchev specifically addressed trucks. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversations with me. Our losses would have been colossal because we would have had no maneuverability. This same Khrushchev, as Soviet premier, would later publicly proclaim that the Soviet Union had achieved victory through its own resources, a contradiction that epitomized Soviet ambivalence concerning American aid. Soviet mechanics who diligently maintained American trucks understood firsthand the vast technological chasm separating American and Soviet automotive engineering. American engines utilized aluminum pistons, while Soviet engines employed heavy cast iron. American trucks featured effective oil filters, whereas Soviet trucks relied on rudimentary settling tanks. American vehicles were equipped with sealed wheel bearings capable of enduring 50,000 kilometers, while Soviet bearings, if fortunate, lasted a mere 5,000. The spare parts system was a source of constant amazement to Soviet mechanics. Americans provided catalogs detailing every single part with its corresponding number. An order placed by number resulted in the exact part arriving. The Soviet system necessitated cannibalizing broken-down vehicles or hand-manufacturing replacement parts. American trucks incorporated essential safety equipment. Soviet designers had never even considered safety glass, mirrors on both sides, backup lights, or horns operable with a single hand. Beyond its immediate military impact, American trucks revolutionized Soviet automotive thinking. Soviet engineers studying American vehicles gleaned invaluable lessons that significantly influenced post-war Soviet truck design for decades. The ZIS-150, the Soviet Union's first post-war mass-produced truck, was essentially a Soviet interpretation of American design principles derived from the Studebakers. American trucks introduced a maintenance culture previously unknown in Soviet practice, encompassing preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, and parts standardization. These concepts were directly adopted from the study of American vehicles and would shape Soviet industrial development for an entire generation. The Soviet failure in the 1939-40 Winter War against Finland had starkly exposed catastrophic logistical weaknesses. Unable to supply troops situated only 150 kilometers from Leningrad, the Red Army suffered 126,875 dead and 264,980 wounded against Finnish forces that were 1/10 their size. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's post-war analysis identified a critical shortage of trucks as the primary impediment. Soviet forces possessed numerical superiority but were incapable of concentrating their strength due to severe transport limitations. By 1944, American motorized vehicles had effectively resolved the logistical challenges that had plagued earlier Soviet campaigns in Finland. The successful Soviet offensive launched in June 1944 against Finnish defenses was largely attributable to American-supplied transport units that maintained vital supply routes across terrain which had previously crippled Soviet logistical operations 4 years earlier. Soviet official pronouncements frequently emphasized the primacy of railway networks over trucks in facilitating supply efforts, thereby downplaying the significance of American-provided vehicles. However, declassified internal studies from the Soviet General Staff underscore the impossibility of such a scenario. During their retreat, German forces had systematically demolished an astonishing 65,000 kilometers of railway track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 railway stations. While Soviet railway construction battalions could theoretically repair approximately 20 kilometers of track daily under active combat conditions, the restored single-track lines could only accommodate between 6 and 8 trains per day, a stark contrast to the 40 to 50 trains that could traverse intact double-track routes. More critically, railways terminated at fixed locations. The final 50 to 100 kilometers to reach forward combat units necessitated the use of trucks. Without these vehicles, the front lines would have been devoid of essential supplies. The German military had learned this lesson at a considerable cost. Their highly skilled railway engineers initially kept pace with the advancing Soviet forces, but a critical deficiency in trucks meant that vital supplies accumulated uselessly at railheads, while frontline units suffered severe shortages of ammunition. Although captured Studebaker trucks garnered particular admiration from Soviet soldiers, the entire spectrum of American-manufactured vehicles proved equally indispensable. The 51,500 Willys Jeeps dramatically enhanced reconnaissance capabilities and command operations. The 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks provided crucial tactical mobility for infantry platoons, while 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles served as the workhorses of divisional logistics. Marshal Ivan Konev himself noted that Jeeps enabled real-time battlefield command, allowing commanders to visit multiple divisions within a single day, thereby accelerating the decision-making cycle and providing a decisive strategic advantage. The systematic suppression of acknowledgements regarding Lend-Lease aid commenced even before the cessation of hostilities. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Directive No. 7572, mandating the censorship of all photographic depictions of foreign military equipment from public dissemination. The narrative was to exclusively credit Soviet industry with the ultimate victory. This directive initiated a protracted 40-year campaign to systematically erase American trucks from the collective memory of the Soviet war effort. Official photo editors meticulously airbrushed out American vehicles from images, replacing them with Soviet counterparts. Films showcasing American trucks were either edited to remove their presence or entirely destroyed. The memoirs of war veterans were subjected to censorship to expunge any references to foreign assistance. This orchestrated erasure extended to statistical data. The official Soviet historical account, published in 1960, asserted that Lend-Lease constituted a mere 4% of Soviet wartime production. This figure was achieved through deceptive accounting practices that compared American deliveries to the entirety of Soviet production, encompassing civilian goods, and utilized ruble valuations that deliberately undervalued the American equipment. When veterans submitted personal accounts that detailed the contributions of American vehicles, editors routinely replaced specific mentions with generalized terms. The Studebaker brand was reduced to simply truck, and American vehicles became our vehicles. Entire passages were entirely rewritten to eliminate any suggestion of foreign support. As Cold War tensions escalated, this deliberate suppression intensified. By 1948, Nikolai Voznesensky, a member of the Politburo, issued reports claiming Lend-Lease accounted for nearly 4% of Soviet output, while simultaneously denouncing the United States as the vanguard of the anti-democratic bloc. This became the officially sanctioned historical interpretation for the subsequent 4 decades. Soviet historians who were privy to the factual evidence faced a precarious dilemma: either perpetuate falsehoods or jeopardize their professional careers. The majority opted for self-preservation, producing historical accounts that attributed the victory solely to the prowess of Soviet industry. This distortion profoundly impacted the educational system. Soviet school children were indoctrinated with the belief that their nation had single-handedly vanquished Hitler. Museums displayed captured German armaments but deliberately concealed the presence of American vehicles. War memorials lauded Soviet tanks, but made no mention of the trucks that facilitated the delivery of ammunition to the front lines. It was only with the advent of Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policy that open and truthful discourse became permissible. In 1989, the Military History Journal published transcripts from the Tehran Conference, which included Joseph Stalin's candid admission regarding the reliance on Allied aid. The public reaction was seismic. Citizens discovered that their entire understanding of the war had been constructed upon a foundation of untruths. Veterans, emboldened, began to speak with unvarnished honesty. At a reunion in Moscow in 1990, former drivers recounted their experiences, testifying about the American trucks they had operated and revealing stories that had been concealed for 45 years. Archival discoveries proved to be astonishing. Researchers unearthed evidence of dual accounting systems, one set of figures for internal planning and another, falsified set for public consumption. The authentic figures revealed that American trucks constituted 70% of the Soviet Union's transportation capacity by 1945. Dr. Boris Sokolov, examining newly accessible archives, calculated that without American trucks, every major Soviet offensive after the Battle of Stalingrad would have faltered. The Red Army's march to Berlin was accomplished on American footwear and facilitated by American trucks. The Battle of Berlin, fought in April and May of 1945, served as the ultimate testament to the critical importance of American trucks. The logistical demands were immense, involving 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and 41,600 artillery pieces, all requiring a continuous flow of supplies across devastated German territory. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front alone necessitated 25,000 tons of provisions daily. His logistical network comprised 22,000 trucks, 16,000 of which were American-made. The expenditure of ammunition, totaling 2.5 million artillery shells in the initial week of the offensive, demanded constant resupply runs by trucks operating under intense enemy fire. Each American truck completed an average of 4 supply sorties daily, covering a round trip of 100 kilometers. Soviet trucks, when operational, could manage only one such run before succumbing to mechanical failure. Even in the triumphant moment of victory, this dependency persisted. The victory parade through Berlin was conducted using American vehicles, which were deemed the most presentable and reliable. Soviet forces conquered Hitler's capital riding in trucks provided by President Roosevelt. The comprehensive accounting of American aid, finally unveiled following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was truly staggering. Vehicle deliveries alone amounted to 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,330 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, and 2,328 ordnance service vehicles. Supporting materials included 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.4 million pairs of boots, 1,911 steam locomotives, and 11,075 railroad cars. The delivery of vehicles alone surpassed the total number of trucks produced by Germany throughout the entire war, providing sufficient transport capacity to fully mechanize 60 rifle divisions. By the war's conclusion, American vehicles had transported 60% of all ammunition, moved 70% of all fuel, evacuated 65% of wounded personnel, and towed 58% of artillery pieces. In the immediate post-war period, appreciative Soviet officials proposed the erection of monuments to commemorate American assistance. Marshal Zhukov, for instance, suggested a memorial dedicated to the Allied arsenal of democracy. However, the Communist Party rejected all such proposals. For 45 years, no monument acknowledged the pivotal role of American trucks. It was not until 2004 that a modest Lend-Lease memorial was finally unveiled in Murmansk. Even then, the unveiling was met with considerable controversy. The conspicuous absence of commemorative structures reflected a deeper tragedy: the systematic theft of historical memory. Millions of Soviet citizens grew up under the impression that their nation had single-handedly defeated Hitler. As the last surviving veterans began to pass away, their testimonies evolved into invaluable historical documents. At a gathering in Moscow in 2005, remaining drivers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood with the express purpose of preserving the authentic historical record. They meticulously collected photographs, hidden for 60 years, which depicted American vehicles bearing Soviet insignia. Their final collective statement, signed by 200 veterans, declared, "We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition. This is not a diminishment of Soviet sacrifice. 27 million of our people perished, but truth honors their memory far better than lies. American trucks helped save our motherland." Today, as Russia once again reinterprets World War II history for contemporary political objectives, the Lend-Lease narrative assumes renewed significance. Modern Russian textbooks exhibit an even greater tendency to minimize American aid than their Soviet predecessors, a component of a broader initiative to bolster national pride through historical mythology. Nevertheless, the irrefutable mathematical facts remain immutable. The documented delivery of 427,284 American vehicles, a figure more than double the Soviet wartime production of 205,000 trucks, cannot be erased. The testimonies of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov, preserved in numerous archives, stand as undeniable evidence. The truth serves as a potent reminder that international cooperation, rather than isolationism, was the decisive factor in defeating fascism. The American trucks that conveyed Soviet soldiers to victory were products of democracy's arsenal, generously shared with an ally despite profound ideological divergences. The narrative of American trucks in Soviet service extends beyond mere military logistics. It illuminates how industrial capacity underpins success in modern warfare, how ideology can corrupt historical understanding, and how truth ultimately prevails despite concerted efforts at suppression. The 427,284 American trucks and jeeps that reached the Soviet Union represented the critical margin between triumph and defeat on the Eastern Front. They fundamentally transformed the Red Army from a World War I-era force reliant on railways and horses into a truly mechanized army capable of sustained offensive operations across vast continental distances. Soviet leaders were acutely aware of this reality. Stalin acknowledged at Tehran that without American machinery, we would have lost the war. Zhukov confessed that without American trucks, the Soviet forces wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. Khrushchev admitted that without American aid, the Soviet Union could not have withstood German pressure. Yet for 45 years, the Soviet Union perpetuated a deliberately false historical account. Photographs were altered, memoirs were censored, and statistics were fabricated. The Communist Party deprived its citizens of the true history of their victory, substituting it with a mythology designed to serve political agendas, but ultimately dishonoring historical accuracy. Only with the advent of glasnost did the complete truth begin to emerge from archives, recordings, and eyewitness testimonies. The overwhelming evidence proved that American trucks did not merely assist the Soviet war effort, they were instrumental in enabling it. The Studebakers, affectionately dubbed Zakudnik, go anywhere, by Soviet soldiers, were as crucial to victory as the T-34 tanks celebrated in every memorial. The suppression and subsequent revelation of this truth offer profound lessons that extend beyond the realm of military history. They demonstrate the methods by which authoritarian regimes manipulate collective memory, how political expediency can override factual accuracy, and how truth, against all odds, eventually surfaces despite official censorship. Today, the mathematical reality remains unchanged. Soviet forces triumphed in Berlin riding American trucks. The arsenal of democracy vanquished the Wehrmacht not solely through superior weaponry, but through the vital mobility provided by wheels, 427,284 of them, crossing oceans and continents to propel the Red Army to victory. The American trucks that revolutionized the Red Army symbolize more than mere machines. They represent the potent impact of industrial democracy's productive capacity, shared freely, even with ideological adversaries, proving decisive in humanity's monumental struggle against fascism. The Soviet generals who admitted they would have faced defeat without American trucks spoke a truth that transcends political boundaries. Modern conflicts are not won by courage alone, but by the strategic convergence of bravery and formidable industrial might. Ultimately, the robust Studebakers that endured decades of Soviet service outlasted the fabricated narratives surrounding them. The veterans bore witness, the documents provided irrefutable proof, and history now records. Without American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory. The wheels of the arsenal of democracy carried not just essential supplies, but the collective hopes of nations striving for triumph over tyranny. The ultimate irony lies in the fact that American generosity fostered the very Soviet power that subsequently spent 45 years denying America's contribution. However, truth, much like those dependable American engines, endures beyond the manipulations of politics. Soviet generals were unequivocally correct. They would have indeed been defeated without approximately 400,000 American trucks.